During the 1980s, comic books got darker, gorier, dirtier, and all around a lot more shocking than they had been before. And not a single comic out there was more shocking than Faust, Love of the Damned.
Okay, so like a lot of you out there, I've always collected comics. I've had comic books in my life since I can remember having anything. I read comics before I really knew how to read them. I would just look at the pictures and try to piece the story together until I learned how to read, and comics were basically the reason I learned how to read. So they've always been there. But it didn't accelerate to a collector's level until 1987. How do I remember the year? Because that was the year Anthrax put out the Among the Living album. Now see, Anthrax, in addition to being a heavy metal band, were also big comic book fans. They wrote songs about Judge Dredd. Judge Dredd was on their t-shirts. I believe it was Scott Ian who had the Punisher painted on his guitar. So that kind of like reinforced this idea of a connection between like the music I liked and comic books themselves. And that just got me more into comics. I think I remember the first series I ever put on a pull list was probably that year, was X-Men, Uncanny X-Men, starting just before the Inferno crossover, I think. It was right about then. But I was never happy with just sort of the mainstream Marvel stuff or the regular DC stuff. I like that stuff. But I always ended up looking for stuff that nobody had ever heard of. And this leads me to where I'm going with this. I would look for things like Judge Dredd. And after reading The Dark Knight Returns, I got really into looking for things that had a similar tone and were pushing the limits of what comics really could be. And this was a good time, this 1987, 1988, to be looking for independent comics, because after the success of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 in 1983, there was a literal explosion of black and white independent comics by creators who were trying new things. And a lot of them were funny, like the underground comics of the 60s. I'm thinking right off the bat, The Tick or Too Much Coffee Man. They were funny comics. But a lot of the independent black and white comics tried to sort of out-dark the mainstream. So we ended up with titles like The Crow, Hero Alliance, the Japanese series Akira becoming popular in America, even horrible things like Ripper, which is probably best left forgotten at this point. But the most shocking and the darkest one, and it definitely earned this reputation very, very validly, is Faust, Love of the Damned. Now, I was first exposed to Faust, Love of the Damned when I probably shouldn't have been. And I am completely aware of the irony of this story. I went to a comic convention that was in the basement of a local church in my hometown out on Long Island, and one of the vendors suggested Faust #1 to me.
What?
I don't know why this guy would have suggested a comic book like this to someone who at the time was 15 years old. But I was hooked. Faust is the most violent, the most sexual, and at the time I thought one of the best written comic books I had ever read. It took me about 2 years, so we're going from 1988 to about 1990 to get numbers 1 at that first convention all the way to number 6 in about, I think, 1990. And this was around the time that the publishing schedule of Faust, which was written by David Quinn and illustrated by Tim Vigil, started to get sporadic, let's say. I'm not going to go through a whole list of when each issue was published, but the final issue, issue 15, that finishes up the story, was published in 2012. While the first issue, the one I got at that convention, came out in December of 1988. So, what is that, 25 years to amass the entire collection until all of them are out. Now, it took me a good number of decades to get 1 through 13. I still have those 1 through 13 bagged and boarded in my collection at home. In fact, I have number 1, I should have brought it with me today, autographed by both the artist and the writer. Now, issues 14 and 15, the last 2 chapters of the series, are nearly impossible to get for a decent price. 14 and 15 took about, I think there's 2 years between them, And each one, the last time I looked, cost around $500 each. And that is way too rich for my blood. And I think it's because Vigil and Quinn were having a lot of trouble getting issues out at this point because they were self-publishing everything. And so I pretty much resigned myself to having what I had and never really knowing how the story ends. But then, in 2003, there was an online Kickstarter started in order to publish every issue of Faust as a compendium. The first Kickstarter contributors got a nice hardcover version, and then, a few weeks ago, I managed to get the paperback one. So I finally got a chance to read through the entire story of Faust, Love of the Damned. And now I know how the story ends about, almost 40 years after I originally bought the first issue. So, the question is, was it worth the wait? Now, what's Faust about? If you've never read it before, or maybe you've never even heard of it, well, Faust is the story of Jade de Camp, a female psychiatrist who worked with extremely dangerous, homicidal, and mentally ill people. And she happened to fall in love with one of her patients named John Jaspers. John Jaspers was a psychotic mass murderer who we later find out was working for New York City's most infamous crime boss, known simply as M. M? You getting it so far? Faust, John, M. M is probably standing for Mephistopheles.
Devil!
We'll get there. Okay. So anyway, it turns out that John was working as a hired killer for M and sold his soul to him. And when he tried to rebel against M, M tried to kill him, buried him alive with his claws. He has these claws like Wolverine. And John basically dug his way out of his own grave, had no memory left of who he really was, but knew that he was driven to murder people and started murdering the members of his old gang. Now, the plot is really hard to follow in Faust, and not because it's poorly written. It's not a poorly written plot at all, but we're seeing the story from multiple perspectives, from Jade's perspective in her journals, from John's perspective, which is completely covered in demon hallucinations, and he's not quite sure of who he really is, and you get a shifting perspective. And a lot of the hallucinatory episodes and artwork and stuff like that makes Faust a bit of a dizzying read, really. In addition to the story of Jade and John attempting to figure out what happened and go up against the evil machinations of M, we meet Ron Balfour, who's a trends journalist who gets involved in the whole story of Jaspers and de Camp. We get Captain Margulis, who bears a weird resemblance, it's mentioned more than once, to Elvis Presley. We get M, of course. We find out that he is actually the devil, eventually. And his wife, Claire, who, in my opinion, was one of the most interesting characters in the entire series. She is also a psychotic killer, but she has enough sort of self-esteem or self-worth to go up against M at the end when she realizes that she's kind of getting screwed over. So, if you're interested in reading Faust, the Black Mask edition is out now. You can get it for about $60. And, it's a good story. Was it worth the wait of all these years to find out how the story ends? Well, yes and no. Faust is a really interesting story because it's a portrait of a time in New York City that people often forget about. The story takes place almost entirely between 1988 and 1990 in New York City. And if you are a New York City resident or you know about the history of New York City, this was a very, very, very dark time for New York. It was right before things started to turn around and people started to invest in New York. So the streets were ridden with crime, and that's reflected in Faust. And it's portrayed almost as a sort of apocalyptic atmosphere that everything's happening in. In fact, the first exchange in the comic is between Ron Balfour, the trends journalist, and a prostitute. And the scene ends with the prostitute getting beaten up by her pimp. So that's how kind of dark even just the very beginning of it is. If I had to say anything, the early art, if I had to say anything negative, The early art by Vigil is a little bit unrealistic. He tends to do weird stuff with people's bodies, but that's not really that big of a deal to me because some of my favorite artists did weird things to the human body. Even Jack Kirby had some very odd habits of exaggerating certain things. David Quinn's writing is different, on the other hand. Like I said, it's really well plotted, the story, especially considering how hallucinatory and surreal parts of it get. But the one big drawback is the last 2 chapters are probably the wordiest comic books I have ever read. I don't object to a lot of reading, of course, but I think there should be a certain limit to the amount of words a writer can cram into a panel, even a splash page, because I found myself at certain points skimming over a lot of the sort of pontificating that M, the villain, does at the end, because he tends to get a little bit repetitive. Other than that, though, if you're looking for an artifact that reflects sort of like the very outer edge of what can be done in comic books as far as weird storytelling, sex and violence, and all this other stuff, then Faust is probably something you might want to check out. But I do warn you, it's not for the faint of heart. There's a reason that we're not probably going to be showing a lot of the artwork in here, because YouTube would not be very happy about it. So in the end, my wrap-up is, yeah, it was worth reading the rest of the story, even having waited these decades, and even though the last 2 issues I thought were nowhere near as strong as the previous 13, it was nice to kind of close out this little chapter of my collecting story so that I could kind of move on. Takes a little while sometimes to get past what you're buying up and collecting, but when you feel it, that it's over, there's a certain sense of accomplishment, even though I was only able to read it in compendium form. So that's it for now. Let us know what you think of Faust, Love of the Damned. Have you ever read it? Have you ever heard of it? Is it just not your cup of tea? I understand that. Believe me, it is not everyone's cup of tea. And until then, subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell to get notifications on our future videos. Love what you collect what you love.
If you would join us